Before the moon ever watched her kneel, before the alpha ever turned away, before the pack ever gasped in horror, Callista believed loyalty was love. She believed patience would be rewarded. She believed endurance was the price Omegas paid for protection. For her entire life, she had been the one who never spoke out of turn. The one who accepted scraps of attention like gifts. The one who smiled when warriors dismissed her, who trained her wolf to stay silent when others shifted freely, who convinced herself that being chosen meant being seen. She had been called soft her entire life, gentle, forgettable, safe. But when Alpha Amos Blackridge claimed her as his mate, Callista thought the moon goddess had finally answered her prayers, finally whispered, "You waited long enough. Now you belong." She believed the mating ceremony would be her beginning. She believed the bond between them was unbreakable. She believed his promises meant something. She believed wrong. Because during the one ceremony meant to crown her Luna, her alpha mate chose politics over truth. He chose another woman's hand over the bond they shared. He chose his pack's approval over her heart. And when Callista knelt in the rain, when the elders stripped her of everything, when her body shook beneath the weight of public humiliation, the wolf they thought was weak finally stopped waiting. Not gently, not quietly, but with moonfire in her eyes and silver light in her veins. This is not a story about a broken Omega waiting to be saved. This is not a story about forgiveness or second chances. And this is the story of what happens when the woman they humiliated becomes the force they cannot control. This is the story of what happens when silence transforms into fury. Before we begin, welcome to my channel and thank you for being here. Please subscribe to Ronan's Romance Tales, smash the like button, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every click fuels this growing pack of storytellers. All right. Now let's return to the moment Callista still believed the moon would be kind. Chapter 1. Before the moon judged her. Dawn broke over the Blackthorn Dominion like a hesitant promise, soft light filtering through ancient pines that had witnessed 1,000 ceremonies before this one. Callista stood before the tarnished mirror in her small chamber, staring at a reflection she didn't quite recognize. The ceremonial gown was breathtaking, white silk that seemed to glow in the early morning light, embroidered with silver wolves that appeared to run across her bodice when she moved. The attending maids had laced the corset so tightly she could barely draw a full breath, and when she tried to loosen it, Helena Frost slapped her hand away sharply. "Stop fidgeting," Helena muttered, yanking the laces even tighter with practiced efficiency. "You're about to become Luna of Blackthorn. Start acting like it." Callista gasped softly, gripping the edge of the vanity. "If I faint during the ceremony, the moon goddess should blame this dress, not my nerves." Mira Chen laughed from the corner, where she was weaving moonflowers into a ceremonial crown. "You won't faint. You're stronger than you think, Callista. We've all seen it." "Have you?" And Callista wanted to ask, because she'd spent her entire life making sure no one saw her strength. Strength drew attention. Attention drew punishment. Omegas who stood too tall were reminded, swiftly and often painfully, of their place. But today was different. Today she would stand beside Amos Blackridge as his chosen mate, his Luna, his equal before the pack and the moon. Or so she'd been promised. The memory of his voice still lingered in her mind from the night before, low and certain in the darkness of his chamber, when no elders were watching, no warriors were listening. "Stand beside me tonight," he'd whispered, his hand warm against her cheek, "and never doubt that you belong there." She'd believed him. Moon help her, she'd believed every word. Helena stepped back, assessing Callista with a critical eye that held no warmth. You'll do. That the Alpha has good taste, at least in appearances. In appearances? The words stung more than they should have, but Callista forced a smile. Today wasn't about Helena's approval, or the whispers that followed her through the pack house. Today was about Amos finally making their bond public, about stepping out of the shadows and into the light of pack acceptance. Mira placed the moonflower crown gently on Callista's head, adjusting it with surprising tenderness. There. You look like the moon herself blessed you. Callista met her own gaze in the mirror. Wide, dark eyes that held too much hope, too much trust, too much belief that the world could be kind to an Omega who'd spent her life invisible. Maybe it can, she thought, fingers trembling as she smoothed the silk against her hips. Maybe today, everything changes. Outside, drums began to beat, low, steady. The ancient rhythm that signaled a mating ceremony was beginning. The sound resonated through the floorboards, through her bones, through the very air itself. Helena opened the door without ceremony. It's time. The pack is waiting. The moon is rising. Don't keep the Alpha waiting. Callista took one last look at herself in the mirror, at the Omega who still believed loyalty meant love, who thought patience would finally be rewarded, who trusted that the bond burning in her chest was stronger than pack politics. She took a breath that the corset barely allowed. She lifted her chin the way Amos had taught her in private, and she stepped through the doorway toward the clearing, toward the ceremony, toward the moment that would shatter everything she'd ever believed about love, about loyalty, about the moon's mercy. And the drums grew louder with every step. Her heart beat faster with every breath. And somewhere deep inside her chest, buried beneath years of forced silence and learned submission, something ancient stirred, waiting, watching, listening for the moment when patience would finally end. Chapter 2. The Bond That Lied. The walk to the ceremonial clearing felt both endless and far too short. With each step through the torchlit path, Callista's mind drifted backward, not to the present moment, but to the night everything had changed between them. 3 months ago. The autumn equinox gathering. She'd been serving wine to visiting Alphas when Amos brushed past her in the narrow corridor outside the great hall. It wasn't intentional. The space was tight, the crowd pressing forward. But when his arm grazed hers, the world tilted. Heat exploded through her veins like lightning striking dry wood. Her breath caught. Her wolf, always so carefully subdued, surged forward with a desperation that terrified her. The bond snapped into place so violently, she nearly dropped the tray, silver cups clattering as she stumbled against the stone wall. Amos had frozen mid-step, his back rigid, his hand braced against the doorframe, as though he needed the support. When he turned to look at her, his eyes, usually so controlled, so distant, were blazing with gold fire. "You feel it too," he'd said. Not a question. A statement rough with shock, and something that sounded almost like relief. She'd managed a single nod, unable to form words past the ache building in her chest, the pull that wanted to drag her toward him, the bond screaming, "Mine, mine, mine." He'd looked at her for one heartbeat longer. Then he'd disappeared into the crowd, leaving her shaking and alone. But he'd come back. That night, he'd found her in the gardens where Omegas weren't supposed to wander after dark. She'd been sitting by the reflecting pool, trying to understand what had happened, trying to calm a wolf that had never disobeyed before. "I didn't expect this," Amos had said quietly, appearing from the shadows like a phantom. "I didn't expect you." "I don't understand," Callista had whispered. "The bond is real." He'd knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that her wolf whimpered with need. "The elders will have opinions. The council will have demands. But the bond chose us, Callista. The moon chose us." Those moments had become her lifeline over the following weeks. Secret meetings in hidden corners of the territory. Stolen conversations when the pack house slept. Amos wrapping his cloak around her shoulders on cold nights when they walked the border paths together, far from watching eyes. "You calm my wolf," he'd admitted once, his voice barely audible beneath the wind. They'd been standing at the northern ridge, overlooking the valley, where rival pack territories began. "He's been restless my entire life, violent, demanding. But when you're near—" He turned to her, vulnerability cracking through his alpha mask. "When you're near, he's at peace." She'd reached for his hand then, threading her fingers through his. "Then I'll stay near." But in public, nothing changed. He barely looked at her, and never spoke to her directly, past her in corridors as though she were invisible. "It's safer this way," he'd explained when she finally gathered the courage to ask. "The elders are watching. Rival alphas are always looking for weakness. If they know you matter to me before the ceremony makes it official—" His jaw had tightened. "I won't risk you, Callista. Not for appearances." She'd believed him. Believed that his coldness was protection, not shame. Believed that the distance was strategy, not denial. There were signs she should have noticed. The way he tensed when certain elders mentioned alliances. How he changed the subject whenever she asked about ceremony details. The night he'd pulled away from her kiss and said, "After the ceremony. When everything is secured." Secured. Not celebrated. Secured. But she'd been too grateful to question, too hopeful to doubt, too in love to see the cracks forming in his promises. Last night had been different. He'd summoned her to his private chamber after the pack had gone to sleep. She'd expected another secret conversation, another stolen moment before the ceremony made everything public. Instead, he'd held her like she was oxygen itself. "Tomorrow changes everything," he'd said against her hair, his arms wrapped around her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Stand beside me tonight, Callista, and never doubt that you belong there." "I won't doubt," she'd promised, pressing closer. "I trust you." His grip had tightened almost painfully. "Good. Hold on to that." She'd thought he meant trust in their bond. She hadn't realized he meant trust despite what was coming. Now, as the drums grew louder and the ceremonial clearing came into view through the trees, Callista clutched that promise like a lifeline. The torches blazed ahead, wolves circling in the darkness beyond the light, the full moon rising above the ancient altar where she would finally stand beside him, where he would finally claim her before everyone, where everything would finally make sense. She stepped into the clearing, white gown glowing in the firelight, moonflowers crowning her head. The pack turned to watch, and somewhere ahead, standing at the altar with his back to her, Amos Blackridge waited. She believed he was waiting for her. She believed wrong. Chapter 3. The ceremony begins. The ceremonial clearing pulsed with ancient power, and Callista had seen mating ceremonies before, watched from the shadows as other couples stood before the moon, witnessed bonds made official under the watchful eyes of the pack. But standing here now, stepping into the sacred circle of torchlight, feeling hundreds of eyes turned toward her. This was different. This was overwhelming. The full moon hung massive and silver above the clearing, so close it seemed she could reach up and touch its surface. Its light spilled across the gathered wolves like liquid mercury, illuminating faces both familiar and strange. The entire Blackthorn pack had assembled, warriors standing at attention, omegas clustered in designated groups, elders forming a semicircle around the ancient stone altar that had witnessed countless ceremonies over centuries. And circling the perimeter, just beyond the torchlight, wolves prowled, dozens of them. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, gold, amber, silver, reflecting the firelight as they moved in an endless ritualistic pattern. The sound of their paws against earth created a rhythm beneath the drums, primal and hypnotic. Callista's breath came shallow and quick as she walked the designated path toward the altar. Her white gown seemed to gather moonlight, making her feel exposed and sacred all at once. Every step felt weighted with meaning, with history, with the gravity of what was supposed to happen here. Elder Thorn stood before the altar, his weathered face carved with authority and tradition. To his right stood Elder Moira, her silver hair braided with ritual bones. To his left, Elder Cassius watched with eyes that seemed to measure and judge everything they touched. Omega Callista, Elder Thorn's voice carried across the clearing like thunder. Approach the altar. She moved forward, legs trembling beneath the silk, until she reached the stone platform. Up close, the altar was massive, dark granite marked with ancient symbols, stained with generations of ceremonial offerings. The surface was cold when she placed her hand on it for balance. Kneel before the moon, Elder Moira commanded. Bow your head to the goddess who binds all wolves. Callista knelt, the wet grass immediately soaking through her gown. She bowed her head as tradition demanded, hands folded in her lap, pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The elders began to chant. Low, rhythmic words in the old language that predated the pacts, that called on forces older than memory. The circling wolves howled in response, their voices rising toward the moon in a chorus that made Callista's skin prickle with goosebumps. Pride swelled in her chest despite the fear. She was here. She belonged here. Soon, Amos would stand beside her, and everyone would finally see what the moon had known all along. A commotion rippled through the gathered crowd. Callista kept her head bowed, but she heard the whispers, felt the shift in energy, as someone new entered the clearing. The Silver Fang delegation has arrived, Elder Cassius announced, his tone carefully neutral. Alpha Silas and his daughter, Morgana. Callista's stomach tightened. The Silver Fang pack ruled the Eastern Territories, a powerful alliance, but one Blackthorn had been negotiating with for months. She'd heard Amos mention the talks, the political maneuvering, the delicate balance of power. But why were they here? At her ceremony. Through her lowered lashes, she caught a glimpse of movement. A woman in deep crimson silk glided past, tall, beautiful, with midnight hair, and the confident bearing of someone who'd never been told to lower her eyes. Morgana Silverfang. She took her place among the honored guests, and Callista noticed the glance Elder Thorn exchanged with Elder Moira. Brief, significant, troubling. The chanting continued, but something felt wrong now. The air had shifted, grown heavier with tension that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with politics. Where was Amos? Callista's eyes found him finally, standing to the side of the altar, positioned where the Alpha should be. but he hadn't moved toward her, hadn't acknowledged her. His face was stone, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed somewhere above the crowd rather than on her. He looked like a stranger. "Alpha Amos Blackridge," Elder Thorne's voice cut through the night. "Approach the altar. The moon awaits your choice. Choice, not claim. Choice." Callista's breath caught, confusion blooming into the first seeds of dread. Amos moved forward with measured steps, his expression unreadable. The pack fell silent. Even the circling wolves seemed to pause, waiting. Elder Thorne raised his hands to the moon. "Before the goddess who sees all, before the pack who witnesses all, before the bonds that tie wolf to wolf and soul to soul." He turned to Amos, ancient authority radiating from every word. "Alpha Amos Blackridge, you stand ready to claim your mate and Luna. Speak now the name of she who the moon has bound to you." The clearing held its breath. Callista's heart hammered against her ribs, hope and fear warring in her chest. This was it, the moment everything would begin. Amos opened his mouth to speak, and Callista's world began to shatter. Chapter 4. He took her hand. Amos took a step toward Callista. For one heartbeat, relief flooded through her so powerfully she nearly sobbed. He was coming. He was going to keep his promise. Everything would be. He stopped, mid-step, as though he'd hit an invisible wall. His jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. His eyes, those eyes that had looked at her with heat and need, and something she desperately wanted to believe was love, slid away from her face. And then he turned. Away from the altar, away from her, toward the gathered crowd where Morgana Silverfang stood draped in crimson silk, her expression calm and knowing, and as though she'd been expecting this all along. Amos extended his hand, not to Callista, to her. "No," Callista breathed, the word so quiet it was swallowed by the night. Morgana stepped forward with practiced grace, placing her hand in Amos's without hesitation, their fingers intertwined. The gesture was deliberate, public, unmistakable. The clearing erupted in gasps and whispers, shock rippling through the assembled pack, like a stone thrown into still water. Elder Thorne raised his hands for silence, his expression carefully neutral. "The moon works in ways beyond our understanding. Alpha Amos has chosen Lady Morgana Silverfang as his mate and future Luna of Blackthorn." The words struck Callista like physical blows. Each syllable carved pieces from her heart, from her lungs, from her ability to breathe. "This union," Elder Moira continued smoothly, as though they'd rehearsed this, as though this had always been the plan, "secures the alliance between Blackthorn and Silverfang. It strengthens our borders, our bloodlines, our future." Callista couldn't move, couldn't think. The white gown that had felt sacred moments ago now felt like a shroud. The moonflowers in her hair mocked her with their beauty. She was still kneeling before the altar, the Omega who'd believed herself chosen, now frozen in the posture of submission, while her mate claimed another woman. The bond in her chest twisted violently, a searing pain that made her gasp. It stretched and strained, trying to break but unable to sever completely, leaving her suspended in agony. "Amos!" Her voice cracked when she finally found it, barely audible above the murmuring crowd. The bond." He didn't look at her, kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hand still holding Morgana's, his face a mask of alpha authority that revealed nothing. "This is necessary," he said, and his voice was cold, distant. The voice he used for pack business, for political maneuvering, for decisions that required sacrifice. The voice he'd never used with her before. Necessary. Callista struggled to her feet, legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. The wet grass had stained her white gown, mud clinging to the silk. "You bonded me. You said, you promised." "The needs of the pack supersede individual bonds," Elder Cassius interjected sharply. "Surely even an Omega understands this, Callista. Alpha Amos has made the choice that ensures our survival." Morgana smiled then, small, satisfied, victorious. "The moon goddess clearly intended this union," she said sweetly, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Otherwise, why would the Alpha choose it?" The pack murmured agreement. Already shifting, already accepting, already moving on, as though Callista's heart wasn't being ripped apart in front of them. "You stood in my chamber last night," Callista said, her voice rising with desperation she couldn't control. "You held me. You told me to stand beside you. You told me I belonged." "I said what was required at the time," Amos cut her off. And finally, he looked at her. There was nothing in his eyes. No heat, no regret, no acknowledgement of the nights they'd spent together. The promises whispered in darkness. The bond that still screamed between them, even as he denied it. Just cold, political calculation. "The alliance was being finalized," he continued, each word precise and devastating. "I needed time. You provided it." Used. She'd been used. A placeholder. A distraction while he negotiated with Silverfang, while he planned this public humiliation. The ringing in Callista's ears grew louder. The faces around her blurred. Somewhere distant, she heard wolves howling. Or maybe that was just the sound of her own heart breaking. She took one step toward him, then another, until she stood close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth that might have been guilt in another man. "You promised," she whispered. It was all she had left. That promise. That moment in his chamber when he'd held her like she mattered, when he'd sworn she belonged beside him. Amos said nothing. Morgana's hand tightened in his, and Elder Thorn began the ceremony anew, this time with the correct participants. Callista stood in the rain that had begun to fall, white gown ruined, moonflowers wilting, body shaking with shock and pain, and the beginning of something far more dangerous than heartbreak. Rage. Chapter 5. Unbound. The rain fell harder, cold and merciless, turning the ceremonial clearing into something darker than sacred ground. It became a stage for cruelty. Elder Thorn's voice cut through the downpour. "There remains the matter of the false bond." Callista's head snapped up, water streaming down her face. "False? The bond is real. The moon has spoken through Alpha Amos's choice." Elder Moira interrupted sharply. "What you perceived as a bond was merely confusion, wishful thinking, the desperation of an Omega seeking status above her station." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. But they were different now. Not shocked, intrigued, entertained even. The pack loved drama, loved watching someone fall from grace, especially an Omega who dared to believe she could rise. "That's not true," Callista said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Amos felt it too. The night of the equinox." "Alpha Amos felt nothing," Elder Cassius declared. "He has confirmed this himself." All eyes turned to Amos. He stood beside Morgana, rain darkening his ceremonial cloak, his face still carved from stone. He said nothing, did nothing, offered no defense, no explanation, no acknowledgement that he'd held Callista in his arms just hours ago and promised her everything. His silence was an answer in itself. "Therefore," Elder Thorn continued, raising his staff, By the authority granted to us by pack law and the moon's wisdom, we declare Callista unbound. She holds no claim to the Alpha, no claim to the title of Luna, no claim to the protections afforded to mated wolves. The words landed like physical blows, unbound, unprotected, alone. Furthermore, Elder Moira added, her voice carrying an edge of satisfaction that made Callista's stomach turn, she must be disciplined for her presumption, for daring to stand at this altar under false pretenses, for attempting to manipulate an Alpha into a bond the moon did not sanction. "I didn't manipulate anyone," Callista shouted, fury momentarily overriding fear. "He came to me. He—" "Kneel," Elder Cassius commanded. "No. Kneel, Omega, or warriors will force you." Callista's eyes found Amos again, son desperate for him to intervene, to stop this madness, to admit the truth. But he stood motionless, Morgana's hand still in his, watching as though Callista were a stranger, as though the last 3 months had been a dream. Warriors moved forward. She recognized them, Marcus, who'd laughed at her jokes in the kitchen, Lyra, who'd once told her she had kind eyes. Now they approached with duty-cold faces, hands reaching for her shoulders. "Don't touch me," Callista whispered, but her voice held no power. They forced her to her knees in the mud. Her white gown, already ruined, pooled around her like a burial shroud. Rain soaked through the silk, through her skin, into her bones. The torches blazed brighter in contrast to the darkness, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the pack that watched her humiliation with morbid fascination. "Done 20 lashes," Elder Thorn announced, "to appease the moon for this deception, to remind all Omegas that their place is not beside Alphas, but beneath them." Terror flooded through Callista's veins, cold and paralyzing. 20 lashes would scar her permanently, possibly kill her if delivered with enough force. "This is barbaric," someone murmured from the crowd. Mira, maybe, or another Omega, who understood that this could just as easily be them. "This is justice," Elder Moira countered. A warrior stepped forward with the ceremonial lash, leather braided with silver wire, designed to wound deeply, to ensure the lesson was remembered. He took his position behind Callista, who trembled uncontrollably now, hands pressed against the mud, waiting for pain she couldn't imagine. She looked up one last time. At Amos, at the man she'd loved, at the Alpha who'd promised her protection and was now allowing her destruction. "Please," she whispered. He turned his head away, and something inside Callista broke. Not her spirit, not her will, something older, deeper, something that had been sleeping her entire life, buried beneath years of forced submission and learned helplessness. Her wolf stirred. For the first time in Callista's memory, her wolf didn't cower or hide or bow to dominance. She rose, slowly, powerfully, with a fury that had been building for 23 years of silence. "Enough," the wolf growled inside her mind. The voice was not gentle, not small. It was thunder and moonlight and ancient rage. "We endured for him. We waited for him. We trusted him. And he betrayed us." The warrior raised the lash. Rain poured. Torches crackled. The pack held its collective breath. Callista's hands sank deeper into the mud, fingernails scraping stone beneath the earth. Heat exploded in her chest. Not the heat of the bond, but something far more primal. Power surged through her veins like liquid silver. The lash descended. It never landed, because in the heartbeat before leather met flesh, Callista's wolf finally stopped waiting for permission and took control. Chapter 6. The Wolf Who Was Never Weak. The transformation ripped through Callista like lightning tearing the sky in half. Pain exploded in every nerve, every bone, every cell of her body. Her spine arched violently, bones cracking and reshaping with sounds that echoed across the clearing, like gunshots. Her scream tore into a howl, raw, primal, furious. A sound no Omega should be able to make. Silver light erupted from her skin. Not the soft glow of a normal shift. Not the gentle transition she'd been taught to perform in controlled circumstances under elder supervision. This was violent, uncontrolled, magnificent. Moonlight poured from her body, as though the full moon itself had descended into her veins, as though she'd swallowed starlight, and now it was burning its way out. The silver radiance grew blinding, forcing the pack to shield their eyes, turning the rain into streams of liquid mercury. Her white gown shredded as her body expanded. Bones lengthened. Muscles coiled with power she'd never known existed. Her hands, pressed against the mud moments ago, became massive paws tipped with claws that gleamed like polished steel. The shift should have taken minutes. It took seconds. And when it finished, Callista was gone. But in her place stood a wolf that should not exist. She was enormous, larger than any Omega wolf, larger than most warriors, nearly the size of an alpha. Her fur shimmered pure silver white, each strand catching the torchlight and reflecting it back 100 times brighter. Her eyes blazed with moonfire, not gold like normal wolves, but silver so intense it seemed to glow from within. Power radiated from her in waves that made the circling ceremonial wolves whimper and cower. The very air around her crackled with energy that tasted like ozone and ancient magic. The clearing fell into shocked silence. Warriors stumbled backward, hands reaching instinctively for weapons they weren't carrying. Omegas pressed against each other, torn between terror and awe. Even the elders, who'd seen centuries of ceremonies, who prided themselves on unshakable authority, stood frozen with expressions of disbelief. Elder Thorn's staff clattered from his hands. "Impossible," he breathed. "No Omega possesses that kind of—" "We are not what you claimed we were," Callista's wolf snarled inside their shared mind, her voice resonant and powerful. "We were never weak. We were waiting." Callista felt the consciousness merge, not a battle for control, but a union. Her human mind and her wolf's ancient fury flowing together, understanding crystallizing like ice forming on water. They'd always been this powerful, this strong, but she'd been taught to suppress it, to hide it, to make herself small and manageable and safe for others. No more. Her massive head turned toward Amos. He'd moved in front of Morgana instinctively, protective, but his face had gone pale with shock. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that had dismissed her so easily, now widened with something that looked like fear and recognition. "Callista," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer or a curse. His voice cracked. "What are you?" "We are what you abandoned," her wolf answered, though the words came out as a growl that vibrated through the ground itself. "We are what you humiliated, what you tried to break." She took one step forward. Her paw sank into the mud where she'd knelt in shame moments before, where they'd forced her down, where they'd prepared to scar her for daring to believe she deserved love. The pack scrambled backward. Warriors reached for each other in uncertainty. The ceremonial wolves scattered into the forest, unwilling to challenge what they instinctively recognized as dominant. "We waited for you," Callista's wolf continued, silver eyes locked on Amos. "Endured for you, trusted you, loved you." She bared teeth longer than daggers, each one gleaming white in the moonlight. You chose another. So now we choose ourselves. Elder Moira found her voice. Seize her. She's gone feral. This is... Callista's wolf lunged, not at Amos, not at the elders, not at Morgana, who'd stolen what wasn't hers to take. She lunged toward freedom. Her powerful legs propelled her across the clearing in 3 massive bounds. Warriors dove out of her path. Torches scattered as her tail swept past, extinguishing several and plunging parts of the clearing into darkness. Someone screamed. Someone shouted for the hunting party. But Callista was already gone. She crashed through the circle of trees, into the forest beyond, her silver fur disappearing into shadow and moonlight. Branches that should have stopped her shattered under her momentum. Her paws barely touched the ground as she ran, faster than she'd ever moved, stronger than she'd ever imagined, free in a way she'd never been allowed. Behind her, the clearing erupted into chaos. Ahead of her, the forest opened like a promise. And inside her mind, her wolf sang with savage joy. Run, she urged. Run until they forget your name. Run until you remember who you really are. So Callista ran, away from the ceremony, away from the pack, away from the alpha who'd broken her heart and discovered, too late, that he'd awakened something far more dangerous than love. He'd awakened her truth. And her truth had teeth. Chapter 7. Beyond the Borderlands. 3 weeks in the wilderness changed Callista in ways a lifetime in Blackthorn never had. She'd crossed the border territories that first night, running until her wolf's legs trembled with exhaustion, until the scent of Blackthorn pack markers faded completely, until she collapsed in a ravine, far beyond any hunting ground she'd ever known. When she shifted back to human form at dawn, naked and shivering and alone, she'd wept. For what she'd lost, for what had been taken, for the version of herself who'd believed love was enough. Then she'd stopped weeping and started surviving. The forest taught her things the pack never had. How to hunt without strategy meetings or permission. How to drink from streams without testing for rival pack presence. How to sleep with one ear alert for danger that wouldn't be negotiated away with politics. Her wolf, no longer silent, no longer dormant, became her constant companion and guide. We don't need them, her wolf reminded her each morning. We never did. The transformations came easier now. Callista learned to shift at will, not just during the full moon or moments of extreme emotion. Her wolf's silver form became as natural as her human skin, and the power that had exploded during the ceremony now flowed through her with controlled precision. She was magnificent, and she was just beginning to understand why. On the 7th night, she encountered other wolves at a neutral watering hole. Rogues, mostly, wolves without packs, survivors like her. They'd approached cautiously, wary of a stranger on their territory. Then they'd sensed what she was. One by one, they'd lowered themselves in submission, not from fear, but from instinct. Recognition of something ancient, something that commanded respect without demanding it. An old rogue named Theron had been brave enough to speak. Your bloodline, he'd said carefully, watching her silver wolf with eyes that held knowledge and wariness. It's not common Omega, not even common Alpha. What do you mean? Callista had asked after shifting back, wrapped in the cloak she'd stolen from an abandoned cabin. Lunar-touched, Theron had answered. Possibly royal blood somewhere in your ancestry. The moon doesn't gift that kind of power to just anyone. The silver fur, the size, the aura. He'd shaken his head in wonder. You're the kind of wolf legends are made of. The kind alphas fear. The kind they should fear. Her wolf had agreed with savage satisfaction. Callista spent the following days testing her abilities. She could track scents from miles away, could hear heartbeats through dense forest, could move so silently that prey never knew she was there until it was too late. Her strength rivaled the warriors who'd once looked through her as though she were invisible. The grief that had consumed her that first night gradually transformed into something harder, sharper. Resolve tempered by pain, purpose forged from betrayal. She wasn't broken. She'd been awakened. The borderlands became her territory. She marked trails, learned every stream and cave, memorized the patterns of moon phases and how they affected her power. She wasn't hiding. She was rebuilding. Not into who she'd been, but into who she was always meant to be. Other wolves began to whisper about her. The silver wolf of the borderlands. The Omega who wasn't. The wolf who glowed like moonlight and commanded respect without speaking. Word traveled the way it always did between territories, through rogues and traders, through gossip at neutral grounds, through the mysterious network that connected all wolves whether they belonged to packs or not. Eventually, the whispers reached Blackthorn. Amos heard the rumors 3 weeks after the ceremony. "There's a wolf in the borderlands," Marcus reported during the morning council meeting, his voice uncertain. "Silver, powerful. Some rogues say she's—" "She?" Amos's head snapped up. Marcus hesitated. "They say she's lunar-touched, that she appeared the night of the full moon ceremony, that she—" He trailed off, but Amos understood. Callista, and she hadn't died in the forest, as the elders had quietly suggested might happen. She hadn't crawled back, begging for mercy. She hadn't broken. She'd thrived. Amos stood abruptly. "Prepare a tracking party." "Alpha?" Elder Thorn frowned. "The Silver Fang Alliance is secure." Amos cut him off. His jaw tightened. "I need to find her." "Why?" Morgana asked from her place at the table, her voice cool. "She's just an Omega who ran away." "No," Amos said quietly, remembering silver light and moonfire eyes, remembering the power that had exploded from the wolf he'd thought was weak. "She was never just an Omega." He'd been a fool not to see it. And now he needed to find her, before someone else did. Before she decided she didn't want to be found. Chapter 8. The Alpha Who Came Too Late. Amos found her at the northern ridge where the borderlands met unclaimed territory, standing in a clearing bathed in twilight. She didn't run when she sensed his approach, didn't shift, didn't even turn around. Just stood there in borrowed clothes, simple leather and cloth that fit her better than silk ever had, watching the sun set over mountains she'd never been allowed to explore before. "Callista," he said, stepping into the clearing with his hands deliberately visible, non-threatening. "Alpha Blackridge," she replied, and her voice was different, steady, calm. No tremor of fear or hope or desperate love, just acknowledgement of his presence, the way one might note a passing stranger. The casual formality cut deeper than any accusation could have. "I've been searching for you," Amos continued, but moving closer. "For weeks, the pack has a Luna," Callista interrupted, finally turning to face him. "Morgana, remember, your necessary alliance." The moonlight caught her features, and Amos felt his breath catch. She looked different, not broken or diminished as he'd feared. She looked stronger, taller. Her eyes held a confidence that radiated from within, and her posture, once carefully submissive, now commanded the space around her with effortless authority. She was stunning, and she was looking at him like he meant nothing. "That's what I came to explain," Amos said, and he hated how his voice sounded, desperate, pleading, weak. The alliance was a trap. Morgana and her father manipulated the elders. They threatened war if I didn't comply. threatened to destroy Blackthorn's borders too. "I know," Callista said simply. "You... what?" "I know about the manipulation, about the threats, about the political trap." She tilted her head slightly. "Word travels, even to rogues. I've heard the whole story." Amos felt relief flood through him. "Then you understand. I didn't want to claim her. You wanted to protect your pack," Callista finished, "at my expense." The words landed like stones. True, undeniable. "I made a mistake," Amos said, taking another step forward. She didn't retreat, but her eyes tracked him with the wariness of a predator watching prey. "A terrible mistake. But Callista, the bond between us, it's still there. I feel it every day. The pull, the ache." "I don't." He froze. "What?" "I don't feel it anymore," Callista said, and there was no malice in her voice, just truth. "My wolf severed it the night you let them try to destroy us. Whatever connection the moon forged, we broke it ourselves." "No." Amos shook his head, refusing to believe it. "That's impossible. Bonds don't just—" "They do, when one half decides they'd rather be whole alone than broken together." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind rustling through trees and the distant cry of a hunting bird. Amos tried again. "Come back, please." "I've dissolved the alliance with Silverfang. It took weeks, but I found evidence of their manipulation. The elders have withdrawn their support of Morgana. The pack is ready to accept you as Luna. Everything can go back to—" "Back to what?" Callista's voice remained calm, but steel ran beneath it. "Back to you protecting me in secret while treating me like I'm invisible in public. Back to me kneeling in the mud while you choose politics over promises. Back to me believing I'm less than I am because an alpha said so." "You were never less," Amos insisted, and his composure finally cracked. "I see that now. The power you have, the strength. I was blind, Callista, stupid. But I see you now. I see what you are." "Do you?" Callista stepped closer, and for the first time, Amos felt the full weight of her presence. The dominance that radiated from her like heat. The power that made his own wolf press against his consciousness with uncertain recognition. "Or do you just see something you want to possess, now that you realize what you discarded?" He had no answer that wouldn't prove her point. "You didn't lose me when you claimed Morgana," Callista said quietly, and her eyes, silver-touched now, changed by her awakening, held his without flinching. "You lost me when you let me believe I was disposable, when you let me kneel before the pack and did nothing, when you chose your crown over my heart and called it necessary." "Callista, I loved you," she continued, and for the first time, emotion flickered across her face, brief, controlled. "I loved you enough to be invisible, to wait in shadows, to accept scraps of attention and call them treasures. I would have stood beside you through anything." "You still can," Amos said desperately. "Come back. Be my Luna. Be my mate. I'll spend every day proving—" "No." The word was final. Absolute. Callista turned away from him, facing the mountains again. "I don't want to be your Luna. I don't want your pack's acceptance, or your elder's approval, or your late apology." "Then what do you want?" Amos asked, and his voice broke. She was quiet for a long moment. "Oh, then, to remember, I was never yours to lose." She began walking toward the forest, toward freedom, toward a future that didn't include him. "Callista," Amos called after her, but she didn't stop, didn't look back, and this time he didn't follow. Because he finally understood what he'd always been too blind to see. She'd never been the weak Omega who needed his protection. She'd been the wolf who made him feel strong. and he'd destroyed the only thing in his life worth keeping. Chapter 9. She ruled 6 months after the ceremony that was supposed to crown her Luna. Callista stood at the heart of her own territory, not as someone's mate, not as someone's omega, but as herself. The borderlands had become more than her refuge. They'd become her domain. Word had spread throughout the wolf territories about the silver wolf, the Luna-touched female who commanded respect without demanding submission, who offered protection to rogues and outcasts, who'd built something new in the spaces between established packs. She didn't call it a pack. She called it a sanctuary. Wolves came to her. Not many at first. A few rogues seeking safety, a pair of omegas fleeing abusive alphas, warriors tired of endless politics and power games. But they came because they'd heard the stories, because they'd sensed something shifting in the balance of power, because Callista offered what no pack had ever offered before: choice. You don't have to stay, she told each arrival. You don't have to pledge loyalty or bow to hierarchy or prove your worth. You just have to be honest, be kind, and defend those who can't defend themselves. Simple rules, revolutionary in a world that had always measured worth by dominance and bloodline. Theron had become her advisor, not because she needed one, but because his knowledge of rogue networks and neutral territories proved invaluable. Mira had found her way to the borderlands too, bringing 3 other omegas who'd watched Callista's transformation and decided they'd rather follow strength than endure submission. You're building something dangerous, Theron had warned one night around the fire. The established packs won't like it. They'll see it as a threat. Good, Callista had replied simply. Let them be afraid of what happens when wolves remember they have a choice. Her wolf, no longer separate but integrated, seamless, hummed with satisfaction. News filtered through the territories. Blackthorn struggled under Amos's leadership without the Silver Fang alliance. Morgana had returned to her father's pack in disgrace after the manipulation was exposed. The elders who'd orchestrated Callista's humiliation had been stripped of their positions by younger council members who'd witnessed the injustice and finally found their voices. Amos himself had become somewhat of a ghost, still alpha in title, but hollowed by regret. He sent messengers occasionally, letters Callista never opened, gifts she returned untouched. He wants forgiveness, Mira had said once, watching Callista burn another unopened letter. He wants absolution, Callista had corrected. I don't have that to give. He'll have to learn to live with his choices, just like I learned to live with mine. Tonight, the full moon rose over the borderlands just as it had 6 months ago, massive and silver and watching. Callista stood at the ridge where Amos had found her, where she'd told him no, where she'd chosen herself for the first time in her life. She shifted without effort, her silver wolf emerging like moonlight made flesh, larger now, stronger, more controlled. Power flowed through her veins like a second heartbeat, ancient and undeniable. Other wolves from her sanctuary joined her, not in dominance hierarchy, but in companionship. They howled together, their voices rising toward the moon in a chorus that spoke of freedom, of healing, of wolves who'd found home in the spaces others had overlooked. The moon watched without judgment. It had never judged her. Others had done that. Alphas, elders, on a pack that had measured her worth by submission rather than strength. The moon had simply waited for her to see what it had known all along. Throughout the territories, wolves spoke her name in whispers, some with fear, worried she'd upset the careful balance of power. Some with awe, inspired by a wolf who'd transformed humiliation into sovereignty. Some with hope, wondering if change was finally possible in a world that had always claimed hierarchy was destiny. The silver wolf of the borderlands. The Omega who wasn't. The wolf who'd been broken at an altar and risen with moonfire in her eyes. Callista didn't need their fear, or their awe, or their hope. She'd learned the only validation that mattered came from within, from the wolf she'd always been, but had been taught to hide. She was never weak. She was waiting, so waiting for the right moment, the right transformation, the right understanding that strength didn't require permission and power didn't require approval. And now that she'd stopped waiting for others to see her worth, now that she'd stopped seeking validation from alphas and elders and bonds that could be broken by politics, now she was free. Callista's wolf stood at the ridge, silver fur gleaming in the moonlight, eyes blazing with power that needed no ceremony to validate it. Behind her, a sanctuary of wolves who'd chosen freedom over hierarchy. Before her, forests and mountains and territories that whispered her name with respect she'd never had to demand. The moon hung full and perfect above her, and somewhere far away, in a pack that had tried to break her, an alpha sat alone with his regrets. But Callista didn't think about him anymore, didn't wonder what he felt, or whether he'd learned, or if he missed what he'd destroyed, because she'd finally learned the most important truth of all. She no longer waited to be chosen. She ruled. The end. If Callista's transformation stirred something wild in your heart, if you believe Omegas deserve better than submission, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done beneath that moon. And subscribe for more stories where wolves remember their strength, where the moon rewards patience with power, and where the ones they tried to break become the forces they learn to fear.